Well, hi there, everyone. I'm Jeff Mayers. I'm the president of WisPolitics.com, and here we are with our virtual luncheon for today. And we're looking ahead to the 2025-26 Wisconsin Legislature. This virtual luncheon is sponsored by the State Bar of Wisconsin and Michael Best Strategies. Now, WisPolitics usually does in-person events in Madison and Milwaukee and DC. And certainly during COVID times, we did a lot of these virtual events. And we try to do a few of them every year. And again, if you have suggestions for events, you can always just email me directly, Mayers, Mayers, at WisPolitics.com. Okay, so let's introduce our all-star panel. Thank you very much, panelists, for taking time today to do this. So I want to introduce, in no particular order, but Tanya Bjork. Tanya Bjork is a Dem strategist, most recently to the Harris Walls campaign, and she does many other consultancies. And then we have Keith Gilkes, and Keith is head of and president of Platform Communications and a longtime GOP strategist. And then we have the Assembly Democratic leader, Greta Neubauer. And then we have the new Senate President, Mary Felzkowski. First of all, Mary, congratulations on your new post. So, we had a tragic happening yesterday in Madison. When these things pop up, it's big news, and it's I think disheartening to many people. So we had the school shooting in Madison, and I want to start there because certainly there are always a lot of bills and activity around school safety and how to mitigate school violence, and also about what to do with proliferation of handguns, because a handgun was used in this case. So let's start with you, Tanya. What's your reaction to this? What do you think the body politic can do?
Well, first off, I want to say, my heart goes out to the families of the affected. And I'll just tell you, I think for all of us, when it hits this close to home, it matters even more. I was in Washington, D.C. yesterday and started getting text messages asking if I have a 10-year-old daughter, and asking if she was okay, because the first reports were, a shooting and people killed at a small private school in Madison. And that could have been my daughter's school. That defines the school that she goes to. So for about 5 minutes, I was really concerned that it was, going to affect me even more than it would normally, and thankful to hear that it wasn't my daughter's school. But so I just want to really make sure that I know we all feel this way, that our hearts go out to those families affected. And I think all students and parents, in this area are affected. This was, I think, the 323rd school shooting in the United States this year. Second one in Madison area this year. And, I'm hopeful that means, particularly with this new hopeful, feeling of bipartisanship that may be coming with the closer majorities, that there's something that we can do that is more than thoughts and prayers, although thoughts and prayers are important. I think it's, time that we sort of roll up our sleeves, and, I would leave it to the Senate president and to the Assembly Democratic leader who are on this too, to talk specifically about maybe some of the legislation that might come out of this. But I think that we've got to figure out a way to not have these happen. And hopefully the Wisconsin legislature can do something to address that.
Okay, let's go to Keith.
Yeah, just to echo what Tanya said, my thoughts and prayers go out to the families impacted by this tragedy. And, these aren't easy conversations to have, and especially when you're a parent and you have to have that conversation with a kid about what happened. It tugs at your heartstrings constantly, and it's always something that you're want to be very thoughtful in having that conversation about. ultimately, I think, much like the rest of the world, there's a multitude of factors that are driving many of these instances, and I think it's going to be a multitude of different pieces of legislation and ways to address this situation that we have occurring here. I don't know that it's easy to ever have a one singular good solution, but I think having the dialogue is going to be helpful. It'll inform people. It'll help people make decisions about what they think can or cannot be done and what needs to be done. Ultimately, I think our society is more connected in different ways than we ever have been in the past. And some of that directly impacts kids along the way, whether it's cyberbullying, bullying in classroom, mental health issues, etc. We can go on and on about different things that are probably going to need to be addressed moving forward for the sake of the future of our children and our children's children. Because this is a much different world we're living in than what it was, 5, 10, 15 years ago. So, like I said, I don't think this is an easy conversation to have, and it's going to be a difficult one for a lot of different reasons. But it's worth having and continuing that dialogue so that we can, create a safe environment for our children and make sure that they have every opportunity to have the support of, not only their parents and their family, but broadly society.
Okay, I want to go to the Assembly Democratic leader, Greta Neubauer. Representative, President Biden yesterday renewed a call for universal background checks, national red flag law, ban on assault weapons. So do you agree with that? And what else could be done?
Yes, thank you, Jeff, and appreciate you starting our conversation, recognizing this real tragedy in Madison. I'm sure many folks have seen this, but my understanding is that a second grader called 911 yesterday, and that this is the deadliest school shooting on record in Wisconsin, and it's just an incredible tragedy. I know that people across the state are sending their good thoughts, of course, to those who are impacted, but also really are looking for leadership in this time. And I will say that even before this happened, when I was knocking on doors, this legislative, this election cycle, I heard from parents regularly about school safety, and they really are looking for better from their leadership. And so I am hopeful that we will be able to have a real conversation about those policies that President Biden discussed. In Wisconsin, for many years, we've been talking about red flag laws. We've been talking about universal background checks. These are policies that are widely supported by the people of this state. And I think in particular, when it hits home for kids, people are feeling that this is quite pressing and they'd like to see us take it up. The other thing that I will just note is I know for my school district here in the Racine area, they would really like to invest in school safety. There are important programs that they run. There are physical improvements that they would like to make. And I know that we're going to be having a budget conversation very soon. And I do hope that we're able to keep in mind that investments in K-12 are also investments in school safety. And that's a responsibility, I think, of the legislature for the coming session.
Okay. Senate President Felzkowski.
Well, I would agree with everybody. And I mean, yesterday was a horrific day for the state of Wisconsin. And again, prayers to the family. What's changed? Look back 30 years and 40 years, and we took guns to school because we went hunting after school, and nobody was afraid. Nobody was afraid that they were going to get shot at school. So society has changed, and I think we need to recognize those factors that have changed in our society. And we can pass a lot of different legislation, but until we deal with the underlying causes of the mental health, just from the brief time that we've been able to see, this was a very disturbed young woman. And all of the shooters and all the people that wreak violence on society, we need to start looking at what has caused it, what has changed in that time period. And we can pass a lot of different legislation, but we need to start looking at the root causes. And those are tough conversations to have. Is it social media? Is it cyberbullying? Is it too much screen time in our children? Is it violence that we've allowed them to watch at a young age? And I hope we can come together with a lot of tough conversations and look at that. And I would like to see us, this was a school that obviously didn't have any kind of screening material to prevent that gun from walking through there. Those are conversations that we should have in this budget to help fund um, ideas so that people can't walk through the door with no screening. So I think it's a little premature to see exactly what happened there. But there needs to be very tough conversations of what's changed in society to allow this type of violence. And what is it that's going on in a young woman's life that she felt this was her only option to lead to this type of violence and then to take her own life? Because that's the deeper and the root cause to lead somebody to perform that type of violence on her fellow classmates as well on as a teacher.
Yes, thank you all. Right, the senator pointed out there, this was at the Abundant Life Christian School, a private school. And so it wasn't like the Madison School District, the training that all of those schools go through. The police chief mentioned a little bit about that yesterday, but I think that definitely there's more to be found out about that. Just as an aside here, the United Way of Dane County is supporting victims through a emergency and recovery fund. So you can go to United Way of Dane County and help out that way if you like. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears here, talk about the upcoming session. There's 37 new legislators in the building come early January. And I want to go to the leaders right now and just what does that mean for how the two houses operate? And I'm not going to ask Senator Felzkowski to say how the Assembly will operate. I'm not going to ask Representative Neubauer to say how the Senate will operate. But what do these narrower margins mean for your houses? Let's start with the new Senate president.
So I think, I think the one thing that I think the public always needs to realize is that 94% of what we do in a bipartisan manner. And I know when I say that, when I go back into my district, everybody's shocked. I'll say, well, what do you think? How much of the bills that we pass now do we pass bipartisan? And they'll say 20%. And when I say it's 94%, people are almost like, you're lying. I said, well, that doesn't make the news because if we're getting along, that, really doesn't sell the media. Will it change things? I think we'll have, I hope if, we'll have better conversations and stuff like that. But make no mistake, we still hold the majority, Jeff. It's an 18-15 majority, and we have a strong majority. We just had an offsite caucus yesterday, and we're pretty strong in our majority. And we're a pretty tight majority. I hope we have better conversations. I hope we have some better negotiations. I would love for the governor to do what Governor Walker did and have Wednesday morning meetings where he met with leadership. And then, as legislators, we could sit down and have conversations with the governor like we could under Governor Walker. I think that would be amazing. But I hope we can have better bipartisan conversation. But Republicans are in charge of the legislature in both houses.
Yeah, and I'm going to point out before I go to you, Representative, the session that is formally ending here, despite, the governor being Democratic and strong majorities in both houses, there were a lot of big things that passed, a lot of big bipartisan things that passed. So even in that environment, it was possible. And yes, Senator, I plead guilty. Media, we concentrate on controversy. So
we do.
Sorry.
And keep in mind, shared revenue was historic. I mean, we did the alcohol bill, the brewers legislation, school funding. I mean, there was some very large things. And I would like to see us, and the governor came out of the woodwork and actually sat down and negotiated with us on that. And I would love to see more of that happening in this session.
Okay. So on to the representative. What's your take on how this narrower majority for Republicans will, what will that mean in the Assembly?
Sure. So I think I'll just start by noting that we got fair maps, right, in earlier this year, and that already started to change how things were working in the legislature. The last legislative session was clearly the most productive that we've had in quite a while, certainly since I've been in office, about 7 years. And I think that was because we suspected that we might be getting fair maps, right? That there was going to be a look at the maps, and it was possible that a lot of people would be running in very competitive districts, and they would have to go home and defend their votes and explain to their constituents why something did or did not happen. And so, as the senator pointed out, it was a productive session. I'm hopeful that that will only continue. I do think things are going to change. As I said, we've got a lot of people, red seats, right? We've got some Republicans, we've got some Democrats who are in very close 50-50 seats, and they are going to be very motivated, I think, to work across the aisle. And I expect that some in Republican leadership will want things to continue as they have in the past, but I expect that a lot of those members who are in those difficult seats are going to be pushing to invest in K-12, right? To lower costs for working families, to take up popular policy. Maybe we'll be talking about medical marijuana, right, in this coming session. So I am hopeful that we are going to see the maps continue to impact the work in the legislature. I fully expect that that will be the case. I will also just note that we have 23 new Assembly Democrats coming in. We've been very busy with orientation, but it really is a shift. That's the majority of our caucus, actually, that's new in this Assembly Democrats. And I think that's really helpful in a moment in which the dynamics are really shifting in the Capitol. We're figuring out how to govern in a new way, to have so many people coming in who are just incredibly motivated, ready to get to work, and ran because they want to govern and because they want to keep fighting for the majority in the years ahead.
Okay. Yeah, we'll come back to medical marijuana. It's on my list of bipartisan opportunities, perhaps. Okay, Keith, what's your take?
I'll spare everyone my commentary on redistricting because Tanya's heard it 100 times before, and we could have an hour-long debate on that. But that being said, my general view in a political sense is that, look, what has happened in the previous sessions, legislative sessions, in terms of both, the general session of running bills through as well as the budget. What you have seen before is probably what you're going to see again in this session. I don't think it'll be much of a shocker to the Senate President's point. The vast majority of these bills are going to be bipartisan. There are going to be some contentious areas where they're not going to agree, and they're going to put bills on the legislature will put bills on the governor's desk that he will veto. But the large swath of legislation will be bipartisan. The second part of that is the budget. And, it just is all going to be contingent on what the governor wants to propose. And will set a tone and direction with the Republican controlled legislature. So these are very, I don't know that things will be dramatically different. What I think you can probably foresee is that there will be some members of each caucus in the Republican caucuses, et cetera, that may press their colleagues for some more compromise in certain spots in certain areas. But fundamentally, there's still some differences between the two parties. We don't have 100% bipartisanship anywhere, and that's fine. It's okay. It's an exchange of ideas and concepts, and ultimately, each of these senators who are going to be up this year in 2026, as well as the assembly members that will be up in 2026, will have to go back to the voters, explain their thoughts, their feelings, and they may disagree on several key points, and it'll be fine, and they'll get reelected. And if that legislator isn't serving their district well, then they may not be reelected. So I while the numbers are shrinking, I don't know that things are dramatically going to change. And again, a lot of this is all dictated by a political environment that we have no idea what 2026 is going to look like. That's a lifetime away. So right now, I think everybody's kind of ready to roll up their sleeve, do their jobs as legislators. And, it'll be up to leadership all around the table to show up and be ready to find those pieces of legislation to compromise on, and the voters can be zeroed in on very specific issues, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later when the election rolls around.
Well, Tanya, this is your chance now to talk about redistricting because Keith can't counter it. Okay, so
No, well, we're all happy with that. We have more fair maps. That's for sure. And I'm an optimist. I know I say this at probably every panel that we do, but I'm an optimist, and I think that having these districts drawn more fairly and make them in many places more competitive will hopefully lead to more bipartisanship and more working together. And we should just be nicer to each other, right? Like, I'm pretty, I don't know. I'm optimistic that this will lead to more productive discussions and maybe less sort of backbiting and the senator's comment about the governor finally coming out of the woodwork gives me a little bit of pause that might not be the case though. But I'm hopeful that these districts will create a more positive environment for bipartisan legislation to get done. But also, as others have mentioned, there are some really big policy differences and different approaches to tackling some really serious problems. And so I'm just hopeful that with the leadership of the Senate president and the Assembly Dem leader in her house, that we'll be able to have some real conversations about real problem solving.
okay. So the budget comes first. It's the biggest thing that happens in the first part of the session, of the 2-year session. And there's a $4 billion surplus. So why don't we just, I'm going to not always start with the electeds, but Keith, why don't you take we remember these rolling surpluses during the Tommy Thompson years. There were rebates and tax cuts and different things, and then we've had a few of those things here in this decade. What should be done with a $4 billion surplus? Can everybody be happy, or does it have to be one policy item?
Well, I think, obviously you can't make everyone happy, that's impossible. I also don't think we have to be completely dogmatic about, only one policy outcome. Ultimately, I think everyone's going to have to address kind of, what has been kind of at the forefront for several years, which is inflation and the economy. We just went through an election cycle where economic issues was the overriding issue for the vast majority of voters in some way, shape, or form, and really influence their decisions when they went into the voting booth. That being said, we're sitting on a surplus. We're lucky. Other states are starting to feel fiscal challenges for a variety of different reasons, either overcommitting on spending or other weakness in the economy, et cetera. So we're lucky, and I think the best thing we can do is have some prudence. We're going to end up having to be negotiating a bipartisan budget at the end of the day. My suggestion and recommendation, if I'm giving advice to a candidate or in a legislator looking at election in 2026, is figuring out how are you going to help people's economic situation, and it always comes down to kitchen table issues. And I think the economy is going to be forefront. Inflation, well, is reduced. It is not eliminated. We are still having challenges in our economy, and a lot of that's going to have to be dealt with at the federal level. But it doesn't mean we can't provide some relief at the state level. And I think that's where the vast majority of Wisconsinites are going to be looking to see some progress, both from the governor and the legislature.
Okay, Tanya, what should be done with the $4 billion surplus?
Well, I think Keith said, the level of the prudence, I think, is a really good one. I think a lot of this money, is one-time money. So, I hope we don't decide to blow it all on one big thing. Like a rebate. I remember getting my check signed by Scott Walker, I think though, in years past, which, was a nice, I don't know, I think it was $28 or something like that. Maybe, but it was nice. But I think I'm hopeful that this legislature will use that money to really invest in some things that could bring some long-term relief, maybe investing in healthcare or education, is sort of is where my head would be if it were me, but it's not. It's Greta and Senator Felzkowski.
Well, right. That's where we're going to end with the electeds on this one. Okay. Well, Senator Felzkowski, you huddled with your caucus yesterday. One thing that comes to my mind is that people are getting their property tax bills now, and they've gone up in many places, in part because people may have voted themselves a tax increase on the school referenda. So what's the caucus's mind, the GOP caucus's mind in the Senate on what to do with the surplus?
So I think there was a point made, and Tanya made it, is the majority of this is probably one-time money. We're waiting to get that determination from Fiscal Bureau. But we're going to do exactly what we did last time. If the majority of this is one-time money, we're going to spend it in one-time projects. So one-time money should be spent on infrastructure instead of borrowing. We'll spend it on our roads. We'll spend it on maintaining our buildings instead of borrowing. One-time money on one-time projects, exactly like we did on last time. And then we'll look at our cost to continue, Jeff. Like 850 is our projected, 850 million is our projected cost to continue on Medicaid. All those are baked in. Those are things that we cannot change. And then when that's said and done, then we'll look at what is the revenue stream coming into the state. And then we'll look at the priorities. Education. Well, if we go with the governor's partial veto, that's baked in. 400 million or 400 in the first year, 400 in the second year. Well, that's a $1,200 increase over the biennium. What is that? And then what's left over? Shared revenue is pretty much on autopilot because we built that in. Then you look at what is left over in this budget cycle. How do we fund our priorities? Education, transportation, corrections is we have to fund our prison system. What is left over as discretionary spending? And Keith made a very good point. Our constituents are hurting. Biden economics did not work. Inflation is hurting people. That was the number one thing people voted on this year in our national elections. And I think if we have a $4 billion surplus and we have too much of our taxpayers' money, and we can return it to them. And when people vote at the local level to increase their taxes, their property taxes, that's a decision they made. And that's a decision they choose to make. And I respect that because I voted to raise my own property taxes for the Tomahawk School District. But I don't think that's government making that decision for them. And I think that's something they can do. But we'll do what we always do. We'll do a conservative budget where we spend within our means. We're not going to be Minnesota where we take a surplus, spend it, and then raise taxes by additional $3 billion on top of that. We'll fund our priorities and we'll return what we can to the taxpayers. But we'll do it in a responsible manner that doesn't put us where we're going to be in 2 years doing a budget repair bill.
Okay, just wanted to explain, when you said the partial veto, you're talking about the per pupil.
Correct.
That is under some litigation.
Correct.
But at any rate, that we're talking about the partial veto that made it go for, I don't know, how many 100 years? I forget. Okay.
Right.
A long time.
400 years, something like that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, there's a lot of pending things right now, but we'll do a very responsible budget. And if this $4 billion, if the majority of that is one-time money, we'll spend it on one-time projects. We sure won't bake it into the base.
Okay.
I just add, I heard the senator talk about Medicaid, and I'm just wondering if is Medicaid expansion going to be finally on the table?
No, we would not cost shift onto the taxpayers what is already being paid because we don't have a gap in Wisconsin. So why would we take people off of private insurance to put them on government insurance and put our hospitals who are already suffering, Tanya, into a worse position with a lower reimbursement rate. We don't need to create more gaps in healthcare when we have people covered.
So for those who are watching, I mean, this is something that Governor Evers puts in the budget every year, and Republicans every 2 years, and Republicans have taken out. So, okay, Representative Neubauer, what should be done with the $4 billion surplus?
Sure. Well, there's a lot to talk about. I will just note briefly on Medicaid expansion that this, of course, is going to continue to be a priority for us. We know that there are some people who are able to be on private insurance, but it is a huge strain on their families, and they frankly are not able to afford it. They are cutting in other areas in order to afford that insurance. That they shouldn't have to, because we should just accept these federal dollars, and we should increase our ability to invest in healthcare, including raising reimbursement rates for hospitals. So on the surplus, I think a couple of things I will just note. Our overall priorities as the Assembly Democrats this year are to lower costs for working families. We were out knocking the same doors that the senator was, and we all heard that people are having a difficult time making ends meet. We would really like to see investments in things that will help families in Wisconsin who are struggling. I would say probably top of that list is housing. We know it's incredibly difficult for people to afford, particularly their first home right now. That's causing a crunch on renters, on many people in Wisconsin. We're hopeful that we'll be able to make some more progress. We did see some bipartisan legislation on that last session. We also know that the child care industry is again going to be facing a cliff as federal dollars run out, what Governor Evers was able to allocate. And that is going to impact people in Wisconsin in a really significant way. That is going to, again, have providers asking if they need to close. They need to lower the number of spots that are available, and have families asking, do I have another kid? Do I go back to work, or is it actually a better deal for me to stay home? That's not the kind of questions we want Wisconsinites asking, especially with the demographic trends that we have and the workforce challenges that already exist in Wisconsin. We also, of course, are going to be focused on education this session. And there are investments that we can make in our schools, in our infrastructure, that are one time. I mentioned safety, right? We know that that's really important for many people in Wisconsin, for parents and for kids. I really think this is going to be a K-12 budget for Democrats. I know in speaking with the governor and speaking with my counterparts in the Senate Democratic caucus, we all believe that it is wrong that people are forced to raise their own property taxes in order to fund their schools. And we know that people in Wisconsin do not enjoy paying their property taxes, and they certainly do not want them to increase, but they feel that they don't have another option because the state is just not keeping up its end of the bargain. So that's going to be a major priority for us in this session as well. And then, of course, there are other infrastructure investments that we can make in roads and bridges, in cleaning up PFAS contamination, in removing lead pipes, in building more resilient infrastructure. We're hopeful that we'll be able to have some really rigorous conversations about that this session.
Okay, I want to stay with you, Representative. So when I asked Keith this question, can you make everybody happy? $4 billion seems like a lot. Like, can't you have tax cuts and help schools and do all these things? Is it possible to do all those things, or does it have to be devoted mostly to a tax cut in order to have an impact? Like Tanya says, getting a rebate check that over $100 may not even, make an impact.
Right.
Can you do more than one thing with $4 billion?
I think you can. I think you can do a number of things. And we, of course, are very open to conversations about a tax cut. Where the rubber hits the road for us is we're just simply not going to give a tax cut to the wealthiest Wisconsinites and people who do not need it. We are very open to considering a tax cut that is targeted, that is focused on middle class and working families. Those are people who are looking at the budget and worried about making it to the end of the month, not able to put money into savings, right? Not able to think about how they're going to send their kid to school because they're just trying to make ends meet. We're all really concerned that there are way too many people in Wisconsin that fall into that bucket. We can have a tax cut that is targeted towards those folks. where, again, we're going to draw the line is it's not going to be a giveaway to corporations. It's not going to be for the wealthiest Wisconsinites. That's just not something that the Assembly Dems are interested in.
Well, Senator Felzkowski, I mean, that must sound familiar because that's what happened in the session is just now ending. The surplus didn't get distributed in part because Governor Evers vetoed the Republican plans for the reasons that the representative is talking about.
Yes, but keep in mind, Jeff, our last attempt at a tax cut was for senior citizens on Social Security and for families making up to $150,000. And the reason that we did that is Governor Evers specifically stated, these were Governor Evers' words, not ours, that middle class, by his definition, were families making up to $150,000. So our last attempt at a tax cut fit the parameters that Governor Evers laid out, and he still vetoed that. So we were at a loss after that. So it seemed that there was no common ground at those tax cuts.
So are you more confident? Are you more optimistic, I guess, this time around that it could be a different story?
One would hope so, but there has to be, I mean, you can't continue to move. If Governor Evers continues to move the needle on what middle class is, then we're kind of at a loss. But in today's economy, when a dozen eggs are $4 and you're trying to feed a family of 4, I have employees where they have 2 young children and their grocery bill is more than their mortgage. $150,000 today is obviously middle class. They're trying to save for their children's education, pay a mortgage, feed their children, and have a semblance at a nice middle class life. They could have sure used that tax cut. It's been hard. So when Governor Evers stated that's middle class, we gave him the tax cut and he still vetoed it. I'm hoping that that needle doesn't move again. So one would hope.
Well, the governor will introduce his budget in February or early March. So
we hope so, yes.
Okay, so the definition of the budget by definition has to be a bipartisan document, and it has been. Although some things didn't get done, like we talked about the tax cut. I want to explore some other what I call bipartisan opportunities. Let's just start with medical marijuana because that was brought up by the Democratic leader, and well, I think the senator has an interest in that. You introduced a medical marijuana bill, and then the Assembly Republicans introduced something that was totally different, and you couldn't agree within your own party on that. So what are the stakes this coming session, and how are you feeling about the pathway for success on medical marijuana, Senator?
So there's really one person that has seemed to be an obstacle to the medical marijuana bill passing. That person has some pretty strict ideas on how that bill should be drafted. So we're hoping to have a conversation in early January to see if there isn't a way that we can come to a consensus between Assembly Republicans and Senate Republicans to negotiate a compromise and maybe move a medical marijuana bill this session. Okay, that conversation has not taken place yet.
I take it that one person is Speaker Voss?
You would be accurate in that assumption,
Okay.
Jeff.
Well, I want to make sure I'm not assuming too much here. Okay.
Yeah. So we're going to sit down with the speaker, have that conversation, because we stood back last session and let Speaker Voss, he put, and there was a lot of really good things in the bill that the Assembly put together last year. There was just kind of one having state-owned dispensaries that neither his caucus nor ours could get around, so could get behind. So we're hoping that Robin will be willing to remove that and we can do something else there and get it done this session.
Okay, well, Assembly Democratic Leader Neubauer, what do you think is the pathway for success on this?
Well, as I said earlier in discussing fair maps and just having so many more members and competitive seats, right? Under the gerrymander, we really only had a handful of folks that were truly accountable to their constituents in the assembly, in the sense that if they voted away their constituents didn't like, they could remove them. And we have a lot more people who are in that position now, and that's very good for democracy. And I think that that is going to impact this conversation in particular in a real way, because we have seen from referendums around the state and polling, of course, and conversations on the doors that medical marijuana is very popular. And I really think the people of Wisconsin have made that very clear. And I hope that there are going to be members of the Assembly Republican caucus that are going to their leadership and saying, listen, it's time. We really need to figure out how to get this done. I have constituents in the Racine area who tell me that they are going across the border to Illinois for pain management. They don't want to do that, right? But they're like, this is the best option available to me. I don't want to be prescribed opioids. And so I'm hopeful that we will be able to have a robust conversation about that this year. And I, again, expect that members of the Assembly Republican caucus will be putting some pressure on Speaker Voss.
Okay, well, let's go to Keith. What do you think are some bipartisan, in addition to medical marijuana, bipartisan opportunities that you see that the legislature can handle? Things that, I mean, every politician wants to reduce healthcare costs, right? Or, you know, tamp down inflation or hold down property taxes. What do you think are some bipartisan opportunities for the situation that's going to happen in 25, 26?
Well, first I'll start with medical marijuana. I think ultimately something's got to be done. We're surrounded by a number of states that have recreational marijuana. So, it's kind of an untenable position to be in, with the exception of Iowa, the only state in the area that it doesn't allow some element of medical marijuana, at least. So I do think there's eventually going to be a pathway to that, getting there and getting to a yes, a bill that passes. Now, one thing I will say though, just because an issue is a 70% issue doesn't mean people are deciding who to vote for in terms of their legislative candidates or their ballot. I've seen a lot of 70% issues over my time in campaigns that you would think would move voters, but they don't ultimately care. They care more about inflation and the economy, and that actually fuels their choice. So I think a lot of the bipartisanship is going to be centered around what are those issues that are top of mind for voters? What are they going to make their decisions on? I think inflation, tax cuts, a lot of what you see coming out of DC is going to be impacting the state ultimately. And, the state legislature and the governor are going to have to be responsive to those policy changes that happen at a federal level. We were just talking about Medicaid. I think one of the things people need to be aware of is, the talk of making Medicaid, it's not just a state program, it's a state and federal partnership. What if under the Trump presidency and CMS, along with Congress, decide to turn it into a block program? Well, the whole deal that was done under Obamacare with 90% reimbursement by the feds goes out the door. And every state that has adopted that is going to have to revamp the entirety of their program. And so you have a Department of Government Efficiency headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, and you don't know what's coming out of that, and you don't know what of that is actually going to pass. It could be significant reform in a multitude of different programs, and it's going to require major surgery within state government operations because we are so intertwined with federal dollars at the end of the day. So this isn't just about what is it that we could do at a state level that's bipartisan. It's going to be how are we going to react to what's being done on a national level, and how does that impact our state and how we're constructed? And I mean, we got to decide whether people are going to renew Obamacare subsidies. That's going to be coming up for a vote as well. I mean, if that completely undermines the entirety of the healthcare system, we're going to have some bigger conversations than we ever expected in 25 and 26. And we'll see how that plays out in an election. We saw how it went last time. Hopefully we do a better job at it this time.
Oh my gosh. I think I just heard Keith Gilkes endorse Obamacare after all these years and all of the
I
benefits
didn't
of
endorse it.
Obamacare.
I just said it's a big problem that we're going to have to deal
Oh
with.
God, see, I just keep hounding you and hounding you and hounding you, and finally you just relent, and finally you understand the benefits of Obamacare and how much money it brings into the state of Wisconsin, not only to pay healthcare premiums, but to bring the cost of care down and everything else. So thank you for that, Keith. I feel like my job here is done.
Just setting it up for you, Tanya.
I'm so overwhelmed. I forgot what the question was.
Oh, okay, what are the bipartisan opportunities here? And, I'll react to what Keith is saying too, because yes, if you turn Medicaid into a block grant, popped up. If you cut the ACA subsidies, will the state react to that? Should the state react to that in a bipartisan way? Because a lot of people are using those in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah. So obviously healthcare is one of the issues that I work on the most. And so for me, I'm hopeful that we can come to some bipartisan solutions on healthcare and how to get more of that federal, not just react to if we get less, but maybe even, and talk about how, we can bring more of our federal tax dollars back to Wisconsin by expanding Medicaid. It sounds like that might be a non-starter still now, but we're always going to be hopeful and always push for that as long as we can, as long as it's still there and it doesn't go to a block grant to the state, which Keith mentioned, which I think would have a devastating impact on care and coverage here in Wisconsin. But in terms of other priorities, I mean, education is hopefully is one where both sides can come together and realize that fully funding education, as Greta mentioned, so we don't have to keep going back to the voters for referendums and the state sort of living up to its expectation of funding of K-12 and also UW funding. I mean, tuition. I'm not quite there yet in having to worry necessarily about tuition. She's still only 10 years old, but I do think about it as it continues to rise. And so hopefully there could be a bipartisan solution when it comes to UW funding, and then back down even to our youngest citizens and childcare. I think childcare is something that middle class families struggle with, and hopefully there can be some sort of bipartisan solution on that as well.
So I got to ask Senator Felzkowski, the governor has said, proposed 800 some million as a boost for the UW system or universities of Wisconsin. Is that a non-starter with the Republican caucus in the Senate, or does it have a chance?
I haven't heard a lot of support for it.
Okay. What about the campuses that have closed? There was a bill that passed to the campuses themselves are owned by the counties, but there was a bill passed to provide funding for the closed campuses. Is there anything more to be done there?
So I think, I've sat down with President Rothman, and I think President Rothman has had some great ideas. And as the UW evolves and as how we learn evolves, we have a lot of non-traditional students. We have students that are learning in different ways. I was just talking with my daughter about one of the girls that she went to high school with, who is living in Superior, Wisconsin, and taking her graduate studies through Tulane University, which we know is not in Wisconsin. So people are being educated much differently than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and even 5 years ago. So do we need all the physical locations? And I think that's something that Jay has been looking at, President Rothman's been looking at, and that conversation will be ongoing. We have we have the 2 years, we have all the 4 years, we have our technical college system. And is it time to close some of those? Maybe some of them, maybe not all of them, maybe strategically. And then, yes, I think it is the state's responsibility to help those counties that own those 2 years, if they do close, to help repurpose some of those buildings and to make sure that, wherever they are, that they become viable options for the communities that they are in. And then the dollars, instead of just putting money into brick and mortar, put those back into educational, put them into teachers, put them into keeping the other university systems and professors to upgrade and to make sure that we have the best of the best in other areas. So being more strategic with our spending is the overall purpose of that.
Okay, before I go to Representative Neubauer for a response on that, I want to tell everybody listening in, you can ask, we're into the question and answer time in the last 10 minutes of this. Feel free to type your question into the chat, and the best way is, Tony Gonzalez, is to type it into the chat, and then I will read it. So anyway, Representative Neubauer, what's your response on the higher ed portion of things and the campuses that, the physical campuses that have had to close or shrink?
Yeah, so I'll be brief, want to get to questions, but what I'll say is it is different to attend classes in person and to attend classes online. I think we want to create flexibility for students. We know in our region, we've got UW Parkside, a lot of students who are working, who are older, who've got families, many first-generation college students and students of color. It's a group of people that appreciates flexibility, right, in their ability to attend university. But if UW Parkside were to close, many of those people, I think, would not continue their education. They would not be able to go to Milwaukee. They would not have another opportunity. And so I think it's really important for us to do everything we can to invest in our public institutions. I do support the ambitious ask that we have seen from President Rothman and the UW system. Again, the money that they're asking for gets us to the median of funding for state universities in the country. That is not asking for the gold standard, right? That's just asking for what they really need to make sure that we are continuing to provide great opportunities to our students. And we know that in the years ahead, we are going to need people in Wisconsin to have more education rather than less. With the trends in our economy, AI, we could spend a lot of time on this, right? But we're going to need people who have some form of higher education or skilled training. And I really hope that the legislature recognizes that it has a responsibility to our public institutions and invests rather than attacking and frankly demonizing the UW system like we've seen in the last legislative session.
Okay, we're going to go to questions. The first one is from the Muskego Mayor, Rick Felzkowski. I hope I pronounced that correct. If not, I'll try again another day. Okay, this is from the Mayor of Muskego. Any chance of looking at the expenditure restraint program for local units of government that rewards local units for being fiscally responsible? Currently, there are communities like Muskego who do not. Whoops, let's see here. I've already interrupted myself. Who do not qualify because we are too fiscally responsible. So what about that? Is there let's go to Senator Felzkowski on that. Did you favor going back and looking at the fiscal restraint program?
So when we did the shared revenue bill last year, that was looked at, and there was negotiation between the three local units of government, the towns, the counties, and municipalities. And there was no appetite to look at that any further. So that was kind of a negotiated bill between the three local units of government. And so I would say not in the near future would that be looked at again after the large shared revenue bill last year.
Okay, Mayor of Muskego, you're going to have to write a letter to the Senate, I think.
Can I just add one thing on this,
Okay.
Jeff? You know, I will say that this is a real priority for our caucus. I was on a call this morning with many of the mayors of the biggest communities in Wisconsin, Racine included. They are having a very difficult time. And especially with federal funds running out, we know that if we don't do more for local government, it will mean real cuts to public health, public safety, our community centers, our parks, things that people really depend on. So I know that our Republican colleagues feel like this was addressed last time, but we are hearing from communities big and small, rural, urban, suburban, that they need us to consider further changes to the shared revenue formula or other ways for them to provide critical services.
So what you're saying is, Representative, despite this big bipartisan shared revenue bill, there's still so much stress on these local governments that it needs to be revisited?
Yes. It does. I mean, we saw a significant increase in the last budget cycle, but it does not make up for the many, many years where the legislature ignored shared revenue and it really had gotten to a breaking point. So we maybe put a Band-Aid on it, but there's a longer term conversation that needs to happen if we want our local governments to be successful.
Okay, here's a question. Does anybody have any further ideas for additional workforce housing? And I open it up to everybody. It just doesn't have to be the electeds. But I think we should try to keep it like one or two people so we can get through some questions here. Keith or Tanya, you have anything to say about workforce housing? Go ahead, Keith.
I'll chime in just because I know a little bit about the topic enough to be dangerous.
Okay.
And so I'll give it a go. Number one, there's a spotlight on this on a national level with the presidents we're talking about it. Reality is presidents have little to no impact on it whatsoever. This is really driven at a local government level and it's and at a zoning level more specifically. And so if you want more workforce housing, it's local governments that got to take this head on and start looking at different ways to deal with the issue, whether it's grandma units in the backyard or plotting new subdivisions. I mean, it's a reality. We don't have enough lots to sell to put housing on it. There are plenty of programs. You see these developers taking advantage of it. Low income housing, historic tax preservation, tax credits, on and on and on. And the state has a number of arms and vehicles in which to leverage those tax credits into more workforce housing. But at the end of the day, the people that are going to be best able to address this are going to be at a local level. And we really need to encourage city councils, village boards, town boards, on the city, everybody has to just kind of at a local level tackle the issue and look inwardly in their cities and their municipalities and their townships and counties and deal with the issue.
Yeah, there was, as Representative Neubauer said, there was a bipartisan package of bills on this very issue, and we did some reporting on it earlier this year, in which there was it's working some places, not working some other places, and so there could be follow-up legislation coming on that, certainly. Okay, this is a question directed to the senator. What is the chance for a driver privilege for undocumented workers?
I can guess who this came from. I'll bet his first name's Tony. How are you, Tony? I don't know. It's a very sensitive topic. I don't have an answer for him on this one.
Okay, Representative Neubauer, anything on that?
I think unsurprisingly, we of course are supportive. We know that many industries across Wisconsin rely on undocumented workers, particularly the dairy industry, but also manufacturing, meat packing. And there's a lot of people who are in our communities who have been here for several decades, and they're worried when they drive their kids to school or their grandkids that they could be deported. So I am hopeful that we will be able to make some progress on this. I, of course, am very worried about what the Trump administration is going to do with their threats on mass deportations. And I hope that we are able to, whether for moral reasons or looking at our economy or something else, come together in Wisconsin and recognize that mass deportations are not going to be good for our state.
Okay, so now here's a question. That comes up during the elections. Is there a bipartisan support for allowing clerks to begin processing absentee ballots earlier? And that bill passed the Assembly, I believe, and then got stuck in the Senate. So what are the chances for that happening? Because every election, it seems, it's the dump from Milwaukee or another big urban area that gets tongues wagging.
So there are many senators that were very much in support of that. The chair of the Senate Elections Committee was not and chose not to hear that bill. He is no longer a member of the Senate. So I'm hoping this year that we will have a committee hearing on that bill if it's brought back, and that we have a robust conversation on that, because I personally think that is something that we should be doing in the state of Wisconsin.
Okay. Now, here's a we're running out of time here, but let's end with this one. Could the panelists speak to the plan for adult education, specifically funding for adult literacy? It's an essential part of overall literacy in addition to the K through 12 and post-secondary education. Now, there is a literacy bill did pass. The funding is hung up, but Representative and Senator, can you speak to the adult literacy issue?
Well, I would like to think that our children are learning to read in school, but we're seeming that we're failing at that, as we have many of our public schools where there's zero proficiency in reading, which is very sad. There's a lot of private entities that are helping with adult literacy. I have not been approached being on joint finance by many groups around adult literacy. I would be very open to those conversations, but I would hope that we would do a better job in our schools, in our public schools, in our school systems, where it would be taken care of. We wouldn't have the issue of adults not being able to read. It would be taken care of as they're going through of our public school systems and our school systems.
Yep, I'll jump in. I mean, I agree with the senator that what we really need is for every kid to get a great education in our public schools. And we know that, again, the legislature just has not been doing its part in funding our public schools. I also know that here in our campus at UW Parkside and at Gateway, right, technical college, they are focused on helping students who need a little bit of extra support when they arrive. When we underfund our institutions of higher education, we are taking away those additional resources that students often need to be successful. And I will also note that we have some great programs like here in the city of Racine that are trying to help folks get into the trades, right? Into apprenticeship programs. Sometimes folks do need a little additional support to be able to be part of those programs, and resources to local governments help us fund things like those career coaches, success coaches, and programs that do help folks bridge that gap between high school and their career.
Okay, well, our time has run out, but I want to really thank all of the people who asked questions and who listened in. And I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions, but maybe we can do something like this again, maybe midstream in the after the budget, or maybe during the budget, and people can get a chance to ask questions. And I really want to thank our panelists, Tanya Bjork, Assembly Democratic Leader Greta Neubauer, Senate President Mary Felzkowski, and Keith Gilkes of Platform Communication, and of course our sponsors, State Bar of Wisconsin and Michael Best Strategies. This is Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com signing off, and happy holidays to all.